Okay, you can all see my screen and hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, so this is not technical, this is much more top level, so give your brains a little bit of a rest now, hopefully. So now I think it's a really good time to be looking at your strategy, business strategy, brand strategy, whatever you want to call it. I think the word strategy has been a little bit, almost the true meaning has been lost a little bit. I think there's a lot of agencies and consultants who claim to be strategists, and they've kind of almost misinterpreted what the definition is as far as I'm concerned. So this is going to cover what it is, what it isn't, and a few ideas for how to implement it. So there's a lot of slides. I'm just going to go through them as quickly as possible. They should all be very self-explanatory, but if anything isn't, just make a note of it, and then either at the end or offline, we can come back to it and discuss in a bit more detail. So this is not clicking to the next screen. Let's give this another try. Here we go. So yeah, we're Cheddar Creative. This is what we do. So the main takeaway here is we do a bit of marketing, mostly design oriented stuff, but we're more kind of upstream. So it's much more about your purpose, your strategy, the actual implementation we tend to leave to kind of others. So what is strategy? Well, the most important thing for me is strategy is about action. You know, actually taking action. It's not about talking a good game, it's about actually doing it. Critical thinking is the key, not wishful thinking. So really getting under the bonnet of your business and, you know, asking those tough questions. A good strategy is empirical and pragmatic. So it's relying on first-hand information, and it has to be practical. So this, I guess, is the dictionary definition. Strategy is strength applied to the most promising opportunity to create an advantage. So if you look at those words I've pulled out there, strength, opportunity, advantage, all very positive. And it is, you know, in essence, that simple. Find your strengths, look at what opportunities are out there, and how can you apply those strengths to those opportunities to create an advantage over your competitors. Sounds simple. So strengths. You want to identify your existing strengths. These are your sources of advantage, and you need to be thinking about how you're going to leverage those strengths. And as well as identifying your existing strengths, look at how you can create new ones. So I've put a little bit here about discovering hidden powers. So you might think you're great at something, but your customer feedback might actually suggest you're better at something else. But unless you've taken that fresh, diverse perspective, you might not have found that out. And also having a bit of time on your hands now, just to step away from day-to-day operations and really analyze what it is that you do and what you're good at. You might discover some of these hidden powers that you can start to leverage. So spot the difference. You know, the main thing about any kind of advantage, you know, you hear the term almost like, oh, is that an unfair advantage? Well, there's no such thing. You know, if you're different from your competitors and there's some kind of asymmetries that you can exploit, there's no such thing as an unfair advantage. You know, carve that advantage out wherever you can. But look at the actions that you can take that are going to be most visible and make the biggest impact. So this kind of summarizes that really. Look at the decisive pivot points. And I don't mean pivot as in kind of taking your business in a new direction, you know, with any kind of leverage. You know, if it's putting a crowbar against a log to lift something, you know, the log is the pivot point. So look at your business and think, what is the pivot point that I can use to create that leverage that is going to magnify the effect of whatever actions I take? So you also need to factor problems into your strategy. There's always going to be obstacles. There's going to be things you have to overcome. We kind of pitch ourselves as creative problem solvers. And the more I've been thinking about that, it's kind of what I've said at the bottom here. You know, problem solving is great. It prevents damage, but it doesn't necessarily create opportunities which create results. So you want to get that balance of solving existing problems that you might have, but also exploring those new opportunities. And a good strategy will help you do both. So it's judgment, ultimately, strategy, a cool-headed judgment. So don't knee-jerk, don't rush straight into things. You know, you kind of need to just take a step back, have that cool-headed judgment. But a judgment is a guess. You want to try and eliminate the guesswork as much as possible. So it is an educated guess. But you're trying to anticipate what your customers are thinking, how they're behaving, you know, actions that your competitors might take. So a lot of it does revolve around just making an educated guess. You know, it is a judgment at the end of the day. So strategy is not just what you're going to do, it's why you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. And a good strategy will multiply the effectiveness of the actions you take and the resources you throw at it. So what strategy is not? Bad strategy is not miscalculation. You know, you're always going to get things a little bit wrong when you are making a judgment. You know, there's knowns and unknowns. So as long as you're using the kind of educated guess approach and you're just a little bit more right than your rivals, then your strategy should be effective. But what a bad strategy is just actively avoiding the hard work needed to craft a good strategy. And it is hard work. We'll get a little bit more into exactly, you know, the kind of steps you can take. But critical thinking does involve that kind of deep thought. And that can be, you know, that can take time, a lot of analysis into your operation. So thinking, oh, well, let's just set a load of goals that we want to achieve and that will be our strategy. Well, that's lazy, and, you know, winging it is not a strategy. So a bad strategy is not making the tough choices that are necessary to move forward. So there's always a temptation if you're in a larger business where you've got a sales team, a marketing team, an engineering team, and they're all pulling in different directions. They all want certain things to be a top priority, and you can't keep everyone happy. You have to look at what is the most beneficial thing for the business in the short term. And if that means I've got to upset the engineering team for the next couple of quarters because we're going to be focusing on sales and marketing, well, so be it. You know, you have to choose that path and eschew all others, however difficult or painful that might be. There could be some great other strategies that are worth exploring, but don't try and do them all at once. The paradox of risk. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you lose the basket, you lose them all. But don't put your eggs in too many baskets, because the more baskets you're trying to manage, the less energy it's self-explanatory. So the knack is to be diversified in your focus, but it has to be focused. So bin the fluff. This, I think, is where a lot of consultants, agencies have fallen down over the years. They're very fixated on vision, values, mission statements, slogans, goals. These are all important things. These all help you create that brand persona, but they're not strategy, and they're certainly not a substitute for strategy. So setting goals without a clear action plan of how you're going to achieve them, it's just wishful thinking. Bangers and Balderdash, I like this heading. So don't get sucked into one size fits all strategy templates and sausage making machines. So again, this is going back to those agencies. You'll go in, you'll have a strategy meeting, a template document will get bored out that you're filling in, and it's the same as what they put in front of every other client. So whatever sector they're in, whatever their goals are, you're basically filling out the same template, and it is just a sausage making machine. It's not tailored to you. It's not taking your specific circumstances into account. So when you are creating a strategy, don't get sucked into stating the obvious and just creating a load of empty rhetoric. I mean, it sounds great and it might make for a good mission statement, but it's kind of meaningless in strategy terms. So you get a lot of universities who will put things on their homepage and in their marketing literature about, we are here to create the next generation of empowered. So you're a university then, you're just stating what you are. That's not a strategy. So it turns out Linford was wrong. I don't know if anyone else is old enough to remember the old Purcell advert from the 90s with the guy who says, if you want to perform like Linford, you have to think like Linford. Positive mental attitude. Well, that's great. And I think, it's better to be positive than negative, but intensely focused desire is not magically rewarded regardless of how well you visualize it. I think there's a lot of new age stuff going around now in business about, positive, focused your energy onto achieving these goals, and you can do it. And well, good luck with that. I think without a really good strategy underpinning it, just thinking that you want it really, really badly isn't going to make it happen. So how to actually create a strategy? Well, you need to identify what is truly important, what's actually going to shift the needle for your business, and start gathering those insights that are going to help you craft that strategy. So what strategy really comes down to in a single sentence is figuring out what's going on here. So to figure out what's going on, you need to diagnose, create a guiding policy, and then create actions. So getting into each of those things in a bit more detail. Diagnose the nature of the challenge, create a method or approach for dealing with those obstacles, and design coordinated actions to execute the plan. So to give you an example, quite a timely example, a doctor's challenge right now is a patient comes in exhibiting symptoms. Could be coronavirus, we don't know. So the first challenge is to identify the illness or the disease. So that's the diagnosis stage. The treatment plan is then the approach. and the prescribed medications and therapies are the actions. So you can see it starts to get a bit more granular until we actually have actions that you can take out and put into effect and see, well, get it work. So you need to narrow your focus when you're starting that kind of diagnosis phase. You know, you really need to be looking at what needs to be done now, and creating that coordinated plan of actions for the high priority objectives. It kind of goes back to, if you're trying to do lots of everything, then you're probably not going to succeed. You know, get as narrow as you can with the focus, and really look at the areas of biggest economic opportunity. You know, if there are lots of things that are potentially viable and potentially profitable, but there's 2 or 3 that really stand out above the rest, we'll focus on those. You know, you can get around to the other ones later. Toss the crystal ball. You know, don't try and look too far ahead and plan kind of, you know, 5 years into the future. Things are changing far too quickly nowadays. You know, there's things just around the corner that are totally unforeseen, like a coronavirus pandemic, so that are going to totally throw those plans out of the window. So, you know, you kind of want to plan ahead. I mean, any plan is looking ahead, but don't go too far ahead. It's a waste of time. And, you know, you've really got to find that purpose that you feel is worth pursuing. You know, it has to be worth pursuing for your business. And look at proximate objectives. So proximate objectives are things that are not way off in the future, and they're realistic. You know, you've got half a chance of actually hitting them. So isolating mechanisms is quite an interesting thing. This is maybe the one technical term in the whole presentation. So you're trying to create actions and put resources into things that are coherent and chain linked. So it's all about building something that's yours, and very difficult for your competitors to replicate. So you could look at someone like IKEA and say, well, in, you know, the decades that IKEA has been going, why hasn't someone else come along that does stylish, affordable, flat pack furniture that you can go into a shop, buy it, take it home, you know, don't have to wait 6 weeks for delivery? Why hasn't John Lewis or someone else got in on this? And the reason is because it's really hard to replicate. You know, the cost of actually replicating that model, you know, having these huge warehouses dotted around all over the place that can store the furniture, having the supply chain, having the brand awareness, you know, having that kind of perception of, oh, it's Scandi chic, you know, it's affordable, but it's really stylish, good quality stuff. For someone to come into that market and try to catch IKEA and overtake them, well, good luck. And by the time they've done it, IKEA are probably another 200 yards up the road. So, you know, you've got to create this business model that the cost of someone replicating it is just too high. So design your coordinated actions to overlap and build upon one another. That kind of just summarizes what I've said there. So things to consider when you're crafting your strategy. A good strategy is all about its design. You know, design is order applied to chaos. So if your business is feeling a little bit chaotic at the moment, think about, how can I apply some order to this chaos and actually design a strategy? So diving a little deeper, Porter's 5 forces, we talked about those last week. Definitely a good starting point when you're crafting a strategy. You need to look at the anomalies, the economies of scale you can exploit. So again, going back to, there's no such thing as an unfair advantage. If there are some strange things going on in your industry that your competitors haven't quite caught on to yet, or little economies of scale you can benefit from, you know, use them to your advantage. So what do you know that others don't? I've put here, what do you know about your customers? That's quite an obvious starting point, but it can literally be anything that you know that your competitors don't. Use it to your advantage. So strategy kind of is a science in the sense that it's a hypothesis. You know, you start with a hypothesis. You have all these knowns and unknowns, and you create a hypothesis based on those things, and then you implement the strategy. And the implementation is the experiment to kind of test, well, what works, what doesn't, you know, feed that information, that insight back in. So you know, a strategy is a living, breathing thing that you constantly need to be evolving. Like we said at the start, if you get it a little bit wrong, don't beat yourself up about it. It's not an exact science. Just keep feeding like what you learn back into the process. Play to your strengths. You can't create advantage from weakness. You can only build on strength. So there's no point thinking, oh, well, our competitors are really, really good at this and we're not so good, so let's try and get better at that. You won't catch them. You know, it's a waste of energy. Look at what you're good at that they're not. So, you know, where is your competitive advantage? Get that balance of, you know, playing to your strengths, but preying upon your competitors' weaknesses. And ride waves of change. So you don't necessarily have to be a first mover. So there's a whole thing about first mover advantage. If something happens and you're the first one on it, then you create that advantage. Sometimes things can just change that you're uniquely qualified to kind of get in on and really kind of create that leverage. So if you know what those changes and those innovations are and you move on them fast enough, you don't have to be first, just move on them fast enough, you know, can you create those opportunities? And this is more kind of general brand building stuff, I guess. What is your mission? You know, if you were recruiting someone, how would you describe what you're trying to do? How would you give them a sense of purpose? So simple equation: superior products and skills plus special or expanded capabilities plus successful innovation, cleverness, efficiency and creativity equals healthy growth, increased market share and stable, sustainable competitive advantage. Easy, isn't it? It's one slide has summed it all up. So just do all of those things and you're done. So top tips, I'm really going to rattle through these because I guess the clock is ticking. Make lists, never a bad idea to make lists. You know, keep on top of everything, prioritize those lists. But if you don't have it there visible, yeah, you're kind of back to winging it and just making things up and firing arrows in the dark. So make lists. Think big, you know, look beyond the obvious. If it's obvious, then chances are your competitors are already doing it or thinking about it. So what would be unexpected in your industry? You know, what would be totally new that no one else is even thinking about? You know, think about what could be rather than what is. So don't follow the crowd. You've also got to question your own judgments. And the whole thing about strategy, as I've said, is a judgment. So there are things that will always impinge upon judgment. And that's, you know, short-sightedness, blind spots, biases. The inside view is a favorite of mine where, you know, your competitors have tried the same thing that you're now thinking of doing as a strategy, but they've all failed miserably. But you think, oh, it's going to be different for us because we're going to do whatever. Chances are, if your competitors and other people have tried this and it hasn't worked for a reason. So thinking it will be different for you, in a way, anyone that starts a business, when the stats suggest most small businesses will fail, they still believe theirs won't. So I think we're all a little bit guilty of the inside view, but you know, if you're aware of it, you can mitigate it. Social herding, they must know something we don't. You know, it's another dangerous thing where you just assume, oh, well, why are they going off and doing this as their strategy? What do they know that we don't? Perhaps we should copy that. Well, often they're just making it up as well. So copying them could be dangerous. So take all of these factors into account when you're creating a strategy and just make sure, you know, critical thinking, question what you're doing. So pick the right target purpose, play to your strengths, keep it simple and achievable. Think tasks, not goals. Focus your efforts and remove limiting factors. So if there are bottlenecks or any kind of pain points, friction points, you know, do your best to remove them or at least try and flatten them out. Focus on effectiveness over efficiency. So efficiently doing a job that doesn't need to be done is pointless. So, you know, being super efficient, like, yeah, that's great. You know, we all strive for efficiency, but effectiveness is the real key. And be a moving target, you know, stay lean and agile and business as usual, you know, the old heuristics of, oh, well, we've always done it that way. Well, if it's working that well, then you're probably not needing to totally craft a new strategy. But, you know, that kind of thought process of, well, that's just the way we've always done it, like bin that. So look for inertia in your rivals. So if your competitors are actually guilty of that kind of, we've always done it this way, so we're going to carry on doing it, well, how can you exploit their inertia to move yourself a bit further ahead? And the partner in crime with inertia is entropy. The law of, you know, things that are left alone will decay. So you need to weed your garden, you know, in a business sense, like look at your processes constantly, you know, are you being efficient? Are you being effective? And if the rot is starting to set in, you know, the kind of business as usual kind of thinking, well, cut it out. And reassess your strategy's effectiveness often. So it kind of ties in very well. If you're constantly looking at your strategy and revisiting it, then inertia, entropy isn't going to set in. So no-brainer stuff. Yeah, this applies just broadly to kind of marketing and brand. Solve a problem, address a need, and create demand. Craft an experience that delights people. You know, if you do those two things, I think you're well on your way to having a very successful product or service. And if you've got a good strategy underpinning it, then perfect. And just a final thought to take away, there is no such thing as an unfair advantage. You know, I'm sure none of you would, but don't feel bad about creating leverage, creating advantage. You know, that's what we're all in business for, is to beat the competition ultimately. And that is that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bit of a whistle stop tour.
You know what? I have to type up notes while you're all talking because of the audit trail. My fingers hurt.
Yeah, no, my voice
awesome.
is a bit, yeah, it's the fastest I've given a presentation for quite some time, but yeah, obviously we'll share the slides. So if there is anything that, if anyone wants to ask me kind of offline, more than happy to do that.
It was a masterclass, so thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Anybody have any questions?
Morgan, I think.
Morgan.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Yeah, thanks very much for that. Brilliant. You mentioned things that work and things that don't. Realised strategy is a combination of intended strategy and emergent strategy. You know, how would you balance that in terms of things that work and you learn by things that don't? Something fails and then there's an emergence.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is that kind of just keeping that lean, agile mindset and almost having a bit of flexibility built into the strategy. Because I'm always reminded of the Mike Tyson quote about, you know, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. And that kind of is very much like business these days. You know, things like coronavirus, like Brexit, you know, all these things that just kind of keep getting thrown at us. And if you're trying to stick to a very rigid strategy, regardless, well, you're just kind of marching to your doom. So I think you've got to almost have a bit of obsolescence built into the strategy and kind of, I think if you know what your purpose is and you know what the priority items that come rain or shine, these are your top priorities and they are the things that really underpin the strategy. Yeah. Then, you know, how you actually execute, you might have to kind of pivot the focus a little bit or, you know, something new could come into the industry where you just have to kind of look at things from a totally different perspective. So kind of have that flexibility built in, I think.
Yeah. I always think it as clouds that come along in obscure reality, but you've got to work your way around them and the clouds disappear and you're back to reality again. So. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I think a good strategy will, you know, if you've crafted it well, then it will allow you to kind of, like kind of find a path through kind of regardless of what's thrown, like the fundamentals should always be there.
Yeah. And if you look at the micro level, you know, strategy as practice is about what people do rather than what firms have. You didn't mention people in that. I just wonder what your views were on. I mean, you could have two teams doing the same sort of thing in a firm, but they have different people and they produce different outputs depending on that. So I don't know what your thoughts are on people.
Well, it's definitely, I think, striking a balance of sort of how you keep, certainly in a bigger organization where you do have kind of lots of teams and they all have a slightly different focus. And if you are going to say, right, the strategy for the next quarter is to look at this particular area, you don't want to put anyone else's nose out of joint. But I think it really comes back to when you build your team, when you recruit those people, it's looking at the values, the attitudes that they have, you know, and making sure there are those shared values are in place so they will hopefully understand, like if you communicate, like if they know what you're doing and why you're doing it and they understand it's good for the business and maybe their time in the sun will come a bit later when these priority things are sorted out. If the values and the attitude in those people are what you need, then hopefully, because people, I mean, it's the most important part of any organization.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about brand sort of way back where there is no such thing as an Apple, a Nike, a Coca-Cola. You know, it's just a group of people that are all under that umbrella. So if you neglect your people, you're always going to struggle. But keeping everyone happy is also impossible. So as long as they're on the same page as you, it should be fine.
Okay, thanks. Great.